Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 3rd of April. Today we're going to be talking about Avdiivka and Bakhmut. So let's begin with Avdiivka. So you've seen Avdiivka finally added some of the routes that the Ukrainians used to enter the city. So here you can see for yourself if you click on the link in the description. You can see all the different routes the Ukrainians are taking. I would say the main routes that they're taking are through the town of Orlivka, which is this town over here. It's sort of in between the Ukrainian rear and the city itself, and so it's a good linking up point for the logistics. And then from there are different routes that branch off into the city itself. Most of them, they go into the northern part of the city around the coke plant, and then others go a bit to the south around the train station over here. And then you also have some other routes going through Lastochkine, which is a town over here, and then it goes through the 9th district of Avdiivka, which is very close to the front line if you zoom in. This is one of the districts that Russia is fighting to take over. There were a lot of reports earlier this week that the Russians were trying to break through over here, launching several attacks in this direction, but since then we have not received any confirmation that the Russians have succeeded in these assaults, which implies that they have been stopped by the Ukrainians, and this would coincide with a lot of the reports by the Ukrainian side that they have been able to repel Russian assaults, specifically in the south, but also on the north towards the town of Stepove. And so in this region, you have many new units that were moved in by the Ukrainians to reinforce the town for as long as possible. So it is gearing up to be an Avdiivka or Bakhmut situation, in the sense that a lot of reinforcements are being moved in from different parts of the front. Just as an example, we have the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which is a unit that fought in Vuhledar. They were one of the main units that helped hold the city both times and conduct the counterattacks. And so now they're being moved into Avdiivka. And we know this because they just recently released drone footage of them storming trenches and hitting the Russian positions that were pretty close to Avdiivka in one of the open fields, probably to the east of it, maybe along this road over here. I'm not exactly sure. Either way, we know that they do have, they're very capable of launching attacks, especially counterattacks, and holding the line for a long time. This is what they did in Kiev, in Vuhledar, and now we'll see if they do that in Avdiivka. We also have the 36th Marine Brigade. We'll see if I can find them over here. Yeah, the 36th Separate Marine Brigade. So they are using their infantry and their drones, and their infantry is equipped with a lot of ATGMs, especially Javelin missiles, and they are using them to repel the Russian tank assaults. Some of the Russian infantry fighting vehicles are advancing, again, as I said before, through these open fields that are near the 9th district of Avdiivka, so this district over here. And then the Russians, they have their positions around Opitny, or a bit to the east around this town Spartak. And around Spartak you have also this mine shaft that the Russians recently took over. So that's really their forward garrison, and then they're pushing past that area along maybe the T0505 road or through the open fields. And it is very difficult to do so because the Ukrainians, they do have their fortified positions on these high-rise apartment buildings in the district, and from there they're firing their ATGMs, and they're not really even using their own tanks and fighting vehicles to repel the Russian assaults. So they're just using infantry, and it's been relatively successful as of the recording of this video. We also have the 110th Mechanized Brigade, which is the unit that is around Stepve, and they are trying to hold back the Russians on the northern flank. They've reported to have destroyed or damaged 4 Russian BMPs, and a lot of the Russian BMPs and tanks that have been rolling through this northern flank around these open fields, they have been damaged or forced to turn back due to a lot of mines that the Ukrainians placed around here, a lot of these anti-vehicle mines that they stationed that have really proven to be a difficulty for the Russians to surpass. And so as of now, Avdiivka is not still in it's not in a red zone, in the sense that it's on the brink of a collapse. It's not the same thing as the Bakhmut situation just yet, and we know this because there was actually a New York Times segment that was released today where the Ukrainian authorities let the journalists enter and see the civilians. There were 1.8 thousand civilians there that are still resigning, which is still a pretty big number because the pre-war population is like 30,000. and it shows that the routes into the city are still open. Now, the military personnel that the New York Times were talking to, they did acknowledge that it is a difficulty in that they are always unsure of whether they'll be shelled as they cross through some of these routes. But given the fact that they are still able to resupply, as seen in the video, by the fact that there were ambulances with an aid that was coming in, we do know that these routes are still relatively safe compared to the ones in Bakhmut, for instance. And so that's the situation over here. But we know the Russians have ramped up their bombardment of the city. They've been targeting key places such as the coke plant, where you have a lot of Ukrainians fortified and stockpiling on weapons. They're targeting the train station, another area where I'm sure they have a lot of men and equipment stationed. They're targeting areas to the north of Vodiane. A lot of Ukrainian sources are actually showing the Russians gaining land in the fields to the east of Zheverny. And so it is a possibility the Russians are conducting offensive operations in this direction. Then again, there's also some reports of aerial activity over the northern flank of Stepove, Berdichi, this entire area. We also know that the Russians, they are using their thermobaric weapons, the TOS-1A flamethrowers. These are very good for urban style combat. So these weapons could be used effectively against apartment buildings where you have a lot of Ukrainian forces holed up in a certain area. There's also a lot of BM-21 Grad shelling that's been reported. We know that the Russians are dropping the Fab 500 bombs, and so these are massive and they are very inaccurate. But it seems like now the Russians are trying to upgrade them, trying to make them into glide bombs, and so that's good because the Russians don't have to drop the bombs directly over their target. The bomb could sort of be dropped at a certain angle, which means that there's a higher rate of preservation of the jets that the Russians end up using as they conduct their operations above Ukrainian airspace around Avdiivka. And so that, again, is meant to target very, very fortified positions that are very strong and hard to penetrate. That's why the Russians are using the Fab 500s. They are pretty old bombs. They've been used since Soviet times. But yeah, this is the situation in Avdiivka. If we go up, we'll see the situation in Bakhmut. So right before I get to Bakhmut, I want to talk about the situation in the areas around the water canal to the south of Bakhmut. So the situation here has been relatively static for past few months. This is because there have been other commitments from both sides, and so they haven't really focused on crossing the water canal on either side. But now we have received confirmation that the Ukrainians have been able to push the Russians out of some of the trench positions that they held up just to the west of the water canal. So the water canal is over here, you can see it, and then just to the west of it you have all of these trenches. You could even see them on Google Maps, which shows how they've existed for a relatively long time and that they are probably by now even larger in scope. So the trench lines, they span from probably around here. They are adjacent to some of the roads, and the Ukrainians, they have been able to conduct counterattacks and clear the Russian positions, probably because, again, the Russians are focused more on fighting within Bakhmut and on its flanks and not really on these, you could even call them tertiary fronts in a sense. And so they've been able to clear the Russian positions, which will take away a key bridgehead that they had that could have been used to later on assault towns like Bilahora, Dilivka, that are then potentially could be used to flank the city of Toretsk. But that's really a long-term objective. Either way, it shows that the Ukrainians do have capabilities to conduct localized counterattacks, and who knows, maybe they'll try to assault Ozaryanivka in the future. And the tactical group in this area is called Tactical Group Azov. This is something that I saw in History Legends video today, which I highly recommend watching. And based on Prigozhin's statements, from this area there were about 13,000 men, probably operating from about here to over here. So that's a very large amount of forces, and we haven't really seen them much in action. Perhaps it's the reason why the Russians have failed to advance as well, because there's so many Ukrainian forces stationed in this general area. And who knows, maybe they'll be used to help in a future Ukrainian counterattack in this direction. We'll try to explore that possibility in a later video. But let's go on to the actual situation in Bakhmut. The Russians, they were able to gain one more block to the north of Korsunskogo streets, slowly advancing through the residential areas towards the main apartment complexes in western Bakhmut, which I'll get into at the end of this video. But we will get to that. First, I want to show Russian gains around the Sobachivka district. They were able to take over the state administration building over here. This is the general area that took over in the past 24 hours since the recording of my last video. A few more blocks as Ukraine begins to retreat from their forward positions in the downtown part of Bakhmut. They have fully withdrawn from the buildings and facilities that are adjacent to the Bakhmutovka River. So this entire rectangle over here is now under Russian control, which means that the Russian forces that were in the Azom district have now linked up with the Russian forces that were fighting in the city center. So now they could work together to push towards the rail line. The rail line that I'm referring to is the rail line over here. So you can see it's a pretty large line, and there are different stations and different buildings that are adjacent to the rail line. There are bridges that go across it, and so it is sort of like a dividing line between two different parts of western Bakhmut. And you can see already that the Russians are advancing house by house, block by block through the first half of western Bakhmut, and so holding on to is becoming very difficult, which is why you may see a complete withdrawal towards this rail line, and it could be used as a very effective defensive position to hold back the Russians for just a bit longer, as really they're trying to extend the amount of time that the fighting occurs in Bakhmut for as long as possible. And so what I expect Russia to do to try to obviate this potential Ukrainian plan is to attack from the north. So you see over here you have this sort of residential area. It's not really filled with many apartment buildings. This district, this is the Selishi district. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but this entire area, it's like one-story houses, and so it's easier to take them. There's also a lot of gardens in between, and so it's not as dense. So the Russians have been clearing it out methodically over the past week or so, and so we may see them actually take over the entire district and then try to flank the Ukrainians as they're retreating to the rail line, and as they're trying to build up their positions over there, and then attack them in this flanking maneuver. And that would really, it really put a wrench in their plans. Also, if the Russians are able to exploit this gap in the Ukrainian lines, they could go to the south and attack the Russian positions, the Ukrainian positions in these apartment complexes. These are some pretty large apartment complexes, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories high. There's also a lot of schools and stores and different shops and large facilities over here that have been used by the Ukrainians to get a very good view of the entire city. Very good for snipers and small arms fire, ATGMs, all of that. And so if you're able to assault these Ukrainian positions head on, it would be very difficult. But if you flank them from the north and you catch them surprised in an area where they may not have reinforced their northern flank that much, because they may be anticipating an assault from the eastern side, then potentially you could cause a larger breakthrough towards really taking the entirety of Bakhmut. And so that's the threat, and that's potentially a course of action that the Wagner Group will go for. Because let's look at the rail line, for instance. Here's the rail line. If we look over here, I'm showing you the Ukrainian perspective looking towards the Russian lines. So the Russian lines are still pretty far away from this area. I can't give you a good estimate, but it would be like around here on the horizon. And so the Ukrainians, they still have the capabilities to hold up the Russians in these different buildings, use them as defensive positions, and then once the time comes, they could cross it over the rail line, across the bridges, then destroy the bridges, and then set up positions, firing positions along these apartment buildings. And so as the Russians begin to cross over the rail line, they'll be fired upon by the Ukrainians, who have the high ground and are able to overlook their positions pretty well. And so that's the issue with going through the rail lines. It is a very good natural dividing line between different parts of the city, and I'll show you the other side as well. And so yeah, it is just a general open area that is difficult to traverse and then assault the next line of Ukrainian defenses, which is why I believe Ukraine will try to center their attacks or their defense, around this area. Now, that's really it in terms of the situation around the train. One more thing before I end the video, it's that the Russians, as I said before, in the Selishi district, they have been able to make some gains. I want to show specifically the gains that they have made. They took over this mini hotel, they took over this drugstore, this pharmacy, all of these different smaller structures, and they have reached this Rose Alley. The Rose Alley is over here, so again, another open area with gardens. And so again, they're advancing block by block through the residential areas. They also took over some blocks over here next to the rail line. So that, yeah, they are beginning to advance in an area adjacent to the rail line. So look out for that. That's it for the video. Thank you guys for watching.